Mark Hacking was everything Lori wanted: charismatic, driven, and deeply in love with her. She believed their life together was the perfect dream, a loving marriage, a future full of promise. She trusted him completely, especially when he talked about becoming a doctor. Mark convinced her that he had been accepted to medical school, that he was working toward a better life for them both. But the truth was far more insidious. Mark had never even applied to medical school. The entire future they were building together was built on a lie. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Mark had lied about his entire past, his education, his career, and even his family. He had created a world of deception so carefully constructed that Lori, even when she started to question things, never saw the full picture. The more Lori discovered, the more she realized that the man she had trusted with her life had been hiding a darkness she could never have imagined. As the cracks in his story began to show, Lori's heart raced with the terrifying possibility that everything about their life together had been a carefully crafted illusion. But just as she was about to confront him, just as she was beginning to piece together the truth, something changed. The lies Mark had told her for years were about to cost them everything. Lori never got the chance to confront him. The truth she was about to uncover would destroy her world, and her life would never be the same. What happened next would expose Mark's betrayal in ways no one could have expected. How much longer could he keep hiding the truth before it all came crashing down? Lori Hacking's life had always seemed like a dream. Raised in Salt Lake City, she had built her life around family, love, and the belief that trust was the foundation of everything. At 27, she was happily married to Mark, the man she loved, and they were expecting their first child. Their world felt perfect: a quiet home, shared hopes for the future, and a growing sense of excitement about their little family. Mark was everything Lori had ever wanted in a husband: confident, intelligent, and passionate about their future together. He spoke endlessly about the life they would share once he became a doctor. He had told Lori that he'd been accepted to medical school at the University of North Carolina, a prestigious program that promised them a bright future. Mark's ambition and drive filled Lori with pride. She believed in him without question. Why wouldn't she? He was the man she'd chosen to spend her life with. But as the months passed, small moments began to feel wrong. It wasn't one glaring red flag. It was 1,000 tiny, almost imperceptible things. Mark's habit of dodging certain questions, for example. When Lori asked about his family, he would give quick, almost rehearsed answers. "It's complicated, Lori," he'd say, "not something we need to get into." At first, Lori brushed it off, but as time went on, she began to notice the cracks, the hesitations in his voice, the subtle shifts in his behavior when certain topics came up. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Mark returned late from an errand. Lori had been waiting for him, filled with excitement to share the news of their baby's progress, but Mark's behavior was different. He seemed distracted, distant. His eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting hers. His usual calm, collected nature was replaced with an air of unease that Lori couldn't ignore. Lori asked him again about medical school. He had always spoken about it with such passion, so surely there had to be some proof: a letter, an email, something tangible. Mark's response was quick but jittery. "It's just a delay with the paperwork," he said. "I'll get everything sorted out soon. Don't worry." But his words sounded rehearsed, lacking the usual conviction. The way his fingers twitched as he spoke, the quick, almost imperceptible glance he cast toward the door, It was all too much for Lori to dismiss. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest. Why had he never shown her any real proof of his acceptance? Why did he seem so uncomfortable when she asked? As the days passed, Lori couldn't stop thinking about it. She was no longer just curious, she was worried. Why was Mark hiding something from her? Was he lying? The next day, as she was cleaning Mark's desk, her hand brushed against something unexpected, an old university application form. It wasn't for medical school. It wasn't even for a program remotely related to the future Mark had promised her. It was for a completely different field, one that had nothing to do with their plans at all. Her heart sank as she read the name of the program. A knot twisted in her stomach. This wasn't just an oversight. This was a lie. Her instinct screamed at her to confront him, but Lori hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if there was a reasonable explanation? But deep down, she knew there wasn't. That night, she couldn't keep it inside any longer. She held the application in her trembling hands as Mark walked through the door. "What's this, Mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the weight of everything she had learned. Mark's face drained of color as he took in the sight of the form. His usual composure shattered. I can explain, Lori," he stammered, but his words came out in a rush, nothing like the calm, confident man she had once known. He backed away from her, a nervous tremor in his voice. "It's nothing, just a mistake." Lori's mind raced. The pieces were finally falling into place. Every lie, every dodge, every evasive answer was coming together in front of her. Mark wasn't the man she thought he was, and the future they had dreamed of, it was all built on a foundation of lies. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me the truth, Mark? Why did you hide this from me?" The betrayal stung, deeper than anything she had ever felt before. But even as the words left her mouth, Lori knew. She was no longer asking for an explanation. She was demanding the truth. But Mark didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes filled with something unfamiliar. Fear. He wasn't the one in control anymore. And in that moment, Lori understood something she hadn't wanted to admit. Her whole life had been a lie. The night Mark Hacking had feared was finally upon him. Lori's confrontation, armed with the damning application form, had shattered the fragile world he'd worked so hard to build. But even as Lori demanded answers, Mark remained silent. It was the beginning of a spiral that neither of them could have stopped. Lori's heart pounded as she watched Mark retreat into himself. His earlier bravado was gone. The man she thought she knew was slipping away, revealing the cold truth hidden beneath years of lies. She could feel the tension thickening in the room, but even as the walls closed in around them, Mark refused to fully admit the extent of his deception. Instead, he chose to deflect, to offer half answers and feeble excuses. "I was going to tell you, Lori, but I didn't want to disappoint you," Mark pleaded, his voice trembling. But Lori couldn't hear it anymore. The lies were too much, and the guilt too apparent in his eyes. Every word Mark spoke now felt like a calculated attempt to salvage what was left of his crumbling facade. But Lori was done. Her trust had been shattered beyond repair. She stood her ground, her stomach twisting with the realization that the man she'd loved, the father of her child, had been hiding something far worse than she ever imagined. It was late when Mark left the house that evening, leaving Lori alone with the quiet devastation of his betrayal. She couldn't sleep. Her thoughts raced, bouncing between disbelief and fury. She walked the apartment restlessly, trying to piece together the threads of a life She thought she understood. What Lori didn't know was that this was the moment Mark had been preparing for. The walls were closing in, and he was running out of excuses. His lies had caught up with him, and now there was no way out. He needed to stop her from uncovering more. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, Mark returned to their apartment. The quiet stillness of the night had given him time to think, time to come to a chilling conclusion. He could not let Lori expose him. She knew too much, and the risk of everything unraveling was too great. When Mark entered the apartment, Lori was already awake, still reeling from their argument. The tension in the air was palpable, but what happened next would shock her to the core. Mark's demeanor had shifted from defensive to something darker, something far more sinister. He was no longer the man who had promised her a bright future. He was someone else entirely, someone capable of doing whatever it took to protect his lies. The confrontation escalated quickly. Lori, distraught, tried to understand how far Mark's deception had gone, but the more she pushed, the more his fear turned to anger. Mark had always been a man of control, but in that moment, he was losing it. The man who had been her partner, her confidant, was no longer there. In a sudden, explosive moment of rage, Mark lashed out. The argument turned violent. He physically forced Lori away, his hands trembling with the realization that his entire life was on the brink of collapse. In that desperate moment, Mark made a choice. He wasn't just protecting his lies anymore. He was protecting himself. He couldn't afford to let Lori live with the truth. Lori fought, but she was no match for the man she had once trusted. In the chaos of the struggle, Mark lost control completely. What had started as an argument about his lies escalated into a violent, uncontrollable rage. The struggle ended with a shocking finality. Lori was dead. Mark, in a daze, stood over her, the horror of his actions slowly sinking in. He had crossed a line from which there would be no return. But even then, as the weight of his crime pressed down on him, he knew he had to act quickly. He had to cover his tracks. The man he had built up for years, the loving husband and devoted father, was gone, replaced by a killer, desperate to bury the truth. He left the apartment in the early morning hours, knowing Lori's body would soon be discovered, but by then it would be too late. The police would be left trying to piece together the fragments of a life that had been destroyed, and all the while Mark would stand by, pretending to be the grieving husband, hiding behind his lies. But one thing Mark hadn't planned for was the sheer determination of those who would search for the truth. Lori's family, the investigators, and even the friends who had been closest to Mark. They would soon begin their own journey to uncover what really happened. And when they did, Mark's world would collapse in ways he never could have imagined. The discovery of Lori Hacking's body triggered an immediate investigation, and from the start, all signs pointed to her husband, Mark. His calm demeanor when reporting her disappearance felt out of place. While others were panicked, Mark answered questions with an unsettling precision, almost as if he were reciting a script. His alibi quickly fell apart. Mark claimed to have been at the gym when Lori disappeared, but there was no record of him being there. Yet despite mounting evidence, Mark stuck to his story, his voice growing defensive with every question. "What more do you want from me?" He snapped at the investigators, his irritation only increasing. Detectives became more suspicious when they learned Mark had been in frequent contact with his friend Ryan on the night of Lori's disappearance. When they questioned Ryan, his discomfort was obvious. He avoided eye contact, and his answers were vague. "We just talked about stuff, nothing important," Ryan said, but his body language betrayed his unease. Ryan's reluctance to reveal details raised immediate red flags. Why was he so guarded? What had he and Mark discussed? The more Ryan withheld, the more the detectives suspected his involvement. They delved into Ryan's relationship with Mark and found troubling signs that he might be covering for his friend. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mark's life revealed a web of lies far deeper than anyone had imagined. His claim of being accepted to medical school was just the tip of the iceberg. As detectives dug into his financial records and personal history, they discovered Mark had been living a double life. He had lied not only about his education, but about almost every aspect of his past. The breakthrough came when phone records revealed a string of calls between Mark and Ryan, both on the night of Lori's disappearance and in the days leading up to it. The conversations were more than just casual check-ins. There was something being hidden, something the two men were desperately trying to cover up. The detectives were closing in. With each new discovery, the web of lies grew more intricate, and the pressure on Mark mounted. Would he crack under the weight of his deception, or had he manipulated everyone around him so skillfully that he could escape the consequences? The investigation reached a breaking point. Mark Hacking's lies were unraveling, but the motive behind Lori's murder still eluded detectives. It wasn't until they dug into Mark's financial records that the full picture emerged. Mark had been living far beyond his means, funding a lavish lifestyle with mounting debt and multiple credit cards under false pretenses. His medical school story was a cover for a much larger financial collapse. Mark wasn't just trying to maintain an illusion for Lori, he was desperate to escape the crushing weight of his own lies. The detectives soon uncovered that Mark had been planning to leave Lori not for another woman, but to avoid facing the truth and to claim her life insurance to cover his debts. Then a breakthrough came with Mark's phone records. He had been in frantic contact with his friend Ryan during the hours after Lori's death. What had been presented as a casual conversation was revealed to be an accomplice helping Mark cover his tracks. Ryan had lied to the police and hidden evidence, but as the evidence mounted, he couldn't keep up the facade. Ryan eventually admitted to helping dispose of the body. The confession revealed the depth of Mark's deception. His carefully crafted alibi and lies had been a desperate attempt to maintain control over a life he could no longer afford. As the investigation reached its climax, the detectives discovered that Mark had planned to flee the state after Lori's death. But when he realized the police were closing in, he stayed behind, sealing his fate. Mark was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Ryan, his accomplice, was also charged with accessory to murder. The web of lies they had built had collapsed, and their lives were forever changed. When the dust settled and the facts had been laid bare, investigators were left with one haunting question. Why did Mark Hacking kill Lori? The lies, the manipulation, the brutal murder, all of it seemed incomprehensible at first, but the more they looked into Mark's background, the more they realized that his actions were not driven by a single moment of madness. They were the culmination of a lifetime of deception, fear, and an insatiable need to maintain control over everything around him. Mark Hacking was a master manipulator, someone who could deceive even those closest to him. He wasn't just lying about his medical school acceptance or his family history. He was lying about himself. His entire identity was a carefully constructed fade built on falsehoods. From a young age, Mark had learned that he could get what he wanted through charm and lies, and he had honed this skill over the years until it became second nature. But beneath this veneer of confidence was a man riddled with insecurities and fear. Mark was terrified of being exposed, terrified of not measuring up to the ideal he had created for himself. He had spent years convincing everyone Lori, his friends, his family, that he was someone special, someone destined for greatness. But the reality was far different. He was deeply in debt, struggling with the weight of a life he could no longer afford to sustain. In many ways, Mark's mind operated like a pressure cooker, with his lies and the expectations he had created for himself piling up until there was nowhere left to go. His lie about being accepted to medical school was more than just a fabrication. It was the cornerstone of his self-image. If Mark had been exposed, if Lori had learned the truth, it would have unraveled everything. For him, the consequences of this exposure were too great to bear. Psychologically, Mark exhibited traits of narcissism and sociopathy. His need for admiration and validation from others was immense, and he sought to control those around him to maintain his false image. Narcissistic individuals like Mark often believe they are superior to others, which allows them to justify their lies and manipulations. In Mark's case, he wasn't just lying to Lori, he was lying to everyone who came into his orbit. His sense of self was so fragile that he couldn't face the possibility of rejection or failure. But Mark's narcissism was combined with a deeper, more dangerous characteristic, sociopathic behavior. Unlike narcissism, which often manifests as a desire for admiration and power, sociopathy is marked by a profound lack of empathy and remorse for others. Mark was able to lie, manipulate, and even kill without the usual emotional response that would stop a typical person from doing so. He wasn't troubled by guilt. In fact, he seemed entirely capable of justifying his actions, even as he took Lori's life. His decision to kill Lori was not an impulsive act of passion. It was a calculated move to protect himself. His escalating lies about his life had finally caught up with him, and murder, in his mind, was the only way out. When Lori began to ask questions that threatened his constructed identity, he didn't see it as a moment to come clean. Instead, he saw it as a moment of existential crisis, one that could only be resolved by silencing her. To Mark, Lori was no longer the woman he loved. She was a threat to everything he had worked so hard to create. What's truly chilling about Mark's behavior is the way he continued to manipulate those around him even after the murder. His calm, rehearsed demeanor in the face of Lori's death, his complete lack of emotional reaction when he was first questioned by the police, all of these actions were not those of a man overwhelmed by grief. They were the actions of a man who had convinced himself that he was above the law, that his lies and his life were worth preserving at any cost. The truth is that Mark never saw himself as a killer. To him, Lori's death was a necessary sacrifice, a means to an end. It was the ultimate manipulation, not just of Lori, but of the entire world around him. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of his psyche is that even now, he likely still doesn't fully grasp the depth of his crime. He didn't kill out of rage or passion, he killed out of self-preservation, maintaining the illusion of control that he had spent his whole life constructing. Mark Hacking wasn't a man driven to murder by a moment of madness. He was a man who had built a life on lies, and when those lies were threatened, he took the most extreme measure to protect them. The coldness and calculated nature of his actions suggest a mind that had long been detached from the normal moral compass that guides most people. The conclusion of the investigation and Mark Hacking's subsequent arrest was a painful moment of closure for Lori's family. They had endured the heartbreaking loss of their daughter, sister, and friend, a woman whose life was stolen by the man she trusted most. The shock of her murder reverberated not only through Salt Lake City, but across the nation, as the extent of Mark's lies became public knowledge. Mark was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His calm, rehearsed demeanor throughout the investigation was replaced by a cold reality. On April 15, 2005, Mark Hacking pleaded guilty to the murder of his wife, Lori. The confession came after months of investigation, and although it provided the family with some semblance of justice, it could never undo the immense pain of losing Lori. In June 2005, Mark was sentenced to 6 years to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole in 2035, but by then, his crimes would be a permanent part of his story. The sentencing was bittersweet for Lori's family, as they finally had some form of justice, but it could not bring their loved one back. The toll that Mark's lies and murder took on everyone involved was devastating. Lori's family was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been so abruptly and senselessly ended. Lori's mother, in her victim impact statement, described the excruciating pain of losing a daughter in such a violent and senseless way. The idea that Lori's life had been taken by someone who had once promised to love and protect her was something no family should ever have to endure. For Mark, his trial was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey through the criminal justice system. His actions left a trail of devastation, not only for Lori's family, but for the community and friends who had once trusted him. Mark's life, his carefully constructed fade of a perfect future, had crumbled in an instant. He would never be the man he pretended to be, and the cost of his lies would haunt him forever. The investigation also left one lingering question that no one could answer. Was Mark always a monster? Or was he a man who was driven to murder by the weight of his lies and his need to maintain control? Could his carefully constructed persona have shielded him from his own reality for so long that murder was the only way he could cope? Or was this a case of a man who had always been capable of violence, lying to everyone, including himself, until the pressure finally pushed him to the edge? What do you think? Was Mark Hacking always capable of such violence, or was he pushed to the edge by his lies? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries. Your support helps us keep bringing you these chilling stories.